I'm Ryan Michael Carter, 26, from Austin, Texas. I work in construction, nothing fancy, just a job that keeps my bills paid and my arms sore. A couple of weeks ago, my buddy Zach hit me up about a camping trip in California. He'd just bought a used Airstream trailer, and he was itching to break it in. It sounded like a perfect escape: booze, grilled meat, and no responsibilities. So me, Zach, Logan, and Eric piled into his truck, hauling that silver bullet straight into the middle of nowhere. The spot Zach picked was deep in some national forest, far from the touristy campsites. He swore it was secluded but not sketchy. Famous last words. The drive up was a mix of good music, dumb jokes, and gas station junk food. Everything felt right, you know? Like one of those trips where nothing could go wrong. The kind that makes you forget real life for a while. If only we knew. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky had turned into this heavy gray ceiling. Storm clouds, thick and ugly. We joked about it, saying it had set the mood for ghost stories. Zach maneuvered the trailer into a clearing, and we got to work. Unpacking, cracking open beers, starting a fire. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a minute, it really did feel perfect. Nature has a way of tricking you like that. That first night, we sat around the fire, telling dumb stories and roasting marshmallows like kids. The rain started slow, just a drizzle, barely noticeable. We didn't care. The trailer had enough room for all of us, and the storm would just add to the experience. The thing about bad situations? They don't announce themselves. They creep up slow, like how the rain picked up, little by little, turning the dirt into mud, making the roads slick without us realizing. We woke up to the sound of heavy rain hammering the trailer. Logan checked his phone. No service. Not surprising. We were deep enough in the forest that even Google Maps had given up on us. The idea of being cut off felt exciting the night before. Now it just felt uneasy. Eric cracked a joke about horror movies starting this way. We laughed, but something about the way the rain slammed against the metal roof made it hard to shake the tension. That afternoon, Zach decided to take the truck and scout the road. Just want to make sure we ain't getting stuck here, he said. Sounded reasonable enough. But when the minutes turned into an hour, and the hours stretched longer, that uneasy feeling settled in, thick as the rain outside. And that was the last time we saw Zach. At first, we weren't too worried. Zach was the kind of guy who took his time with everything. Always the last one to pack, the last one to finish a meal, the last one to admit we were lost. So when an hour passed, we figured maybe he was just taking it slow, maybe checking out the area. But then it stretched to 2 hours. Then 3. The rain didn't let up, and the roads were a mess. Thick, sucking mud that could trap a truck like quicksand. Logan was the first to say it. We should go look for him. Simple, logical. But there was a problem. The truck was gone, and the only way to find him was on foot. None of us liked that idea, but what were we going to do? Just sit here and hope he waltzed back in, covered in mud and grinning? Hope only gets you so far in a situation like this. We grabbed our rain jackets and flashlights and headed out. The forest looked different now. Colder, darker, the trees hunched over like they were watching us. The dirt road had turned into a slippery mess, puddles so deep they swallowed our boots. Every step felt like a fight against the mud trying to drag us down. We called Zach's name, over and over, but the only thing that answered was the endless sound of rain. A mile in, we found the first sign that something was wrong. His tire track stopped, just ended, like he'd been swallowed whole. The ground was all churned up, like the truck had been stuck, but there was no sign of it. No Zach, no headlights in the distance, nothing. Just empty road and rain. That's when Eric noticed something else. Footprints leading off the road. Deep ones, like someone had been dragging their feet. We followed them, calling Zach's name, but the deeper we went, the less it felt like he was out here. The prints were weird, erratic, like he'd been stumbling. Or running. And then, just like the tire tracks, they stopped. Where the hell did he go? Logan muttered, his voice low. None of us had an answer. The rain washed away anything else. If there had been more tracks, they were gone now. Just as we were about to turn back, Eric froze. Do you hear that? At first, I thought it was just the rain. But then I heard it. A noise in the trees. Not thunder. Not wind. Something else. Faint, but there. And it was getting closer. At first, we just stood there listening. The sound was faint, buried under the rain, but definitely not normal. A low, wet crunching noise, like something heavy shifting through the trees. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something else. I felt my stomach twist up, but we had to check it out. Zach was still missing. Eric took the lead, pushing through the soaked underbrush, flashlight beam bouncing off the wet leaves. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until we saw it. Something hanging from a branch. At first, I thought it was just a ripped-up tarp or maybe a piece of someone's tent. But then Logan stepped closer and swore under his breath. It was a jacket. Zach's jacket. And it was soaked in blood. None of us spoke for a second. The air felt thick, wrong. Then Logan grabbed my arm. "Dude, over there." His voice was barely above a whisper. I turned my light toward where he was looking, and that's when I saw it. The truck. It was off the road, shoved between the trees like it had been forced there. The driver's side door was wide open, the inside empty. But the worst part? The windshield was smashed inward. "No way he just crashed," Eric muttered. He was right. It looked like something had come from the outside, like something had reached in. My hands were shaking as I stepped closer, shining my flashlight inside. No blood, no sign of a struggle, just a deep, gaping hole in the glass, like it had been punched through. That's when the smell hit us. Rot. Heavy, suffocating, like something dead had been left out in the rain for too long. And beneath it, something else, something metallic. Blood. A branch snapped behind us. Close. Too close. My pulse jumped to my throat. Logan whipped his light around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move. Not an animal. Not a person. Something else. Low to the ground. Too fast. Then it was gone. "We need to get the hell out of here," Eric whispered. I couldn't argue. But as we turned to run back, a voice cut through the storm. A scream. Not just any scream. Zach. Somewhere deeper in the woods. And it wasn't just fear in his voice. It was pure, blood-curdling pain. We ran. No thinking. No talking. Just pure, blinding panic. Zach's scream had come from somewhere ahead, but the sound bounced through the trees, making it impossible to tell how far. The rain blurred everything, turned the ground into a swamp, made our footsteps loud. Too loud. If something was out there, it knew exactly where we were. "Zach!" Eric yelled, his voice raw. No answer. Just rain and that awful, wet crunching sound again. Closer this time. My chest tightened as we stumbled through the trees, flashlight beams jittering over the trunks. Logan tripped, catching himself on a root, his face pale as hell. "Guys," he panted. We need a plan." But none of us had one. We weren't built for this. We weren't survivalists, weren't trained for some horror movie nightmare. Then Eric stopped so fast I nearly slammed into him. "There," he breathed, pointing through the trees. A shape, slumped against a fallen log. My stomach twisted. Zach. His head hung forward, his shirt soaked, not just from the rain, but from something darker. Blood. A lot of it. Logan rushed over first, grabbing his shoulder. "Zach, man, come on." The second he touched him, Zach's body dropped. Just slid down like a rag doll. And that's when I saw his stomach was torn open. Not just cut. Ripped. Like something had clawed through him. Logan staggered back, making this awful choking sound. Eric swore, stepping away fast. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. That's when we heard it again. The sound. That sick, wet crunching. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind us. Logan screamed first. I turned just in time to see something. Someone, lunging from the darkness. A man, but not really. He was filthy, covered in mud and blood. His face twisted into something that barely looked human anymore. And in his hands? A hunting knife, slick and red. Eric bolted. Just took off. Logan and I weren't far behind. Branches tore at my arms. The mud sucked at my feet. But adrenaline shoved me forward. I didn't look back. Couldn't. But I could hear him. His footsteps pounding behind us. Too fast. Too determined. We burst into the clearing where the trailer was. And that's when it happened. Logan, ahead of me, suddenly stopped. Just stood there, panting. Then, without even looking at me, he muttered, "I'm sorry, man." And then he shoved me. Hard. Right to the ground. I hit the ground hard, my breath punching out of my lungs. Mud and rain swallowed me up, my hands sinking deep. For a split second, my brain refused to believe what had just happened. Logan, my friend, had thrown me down like bait. And in that second of shock, I heard the footsteps change direction. Right toward me. I rolled, scrambling onto my hands and knees as the killer lunged. A flash of silver in the rain, the knife coming down. I barely dodged. the blade slicing through my jacket instead of my back. Too close. Way too close. My heart slammed against my ribs as I kicked out, catching his leg. He stumbled, but didn't fall. His breathing was ragged. His eyes locked on me like a goddamn animal. Then a loud bang. A gunshot. The killer flinched, his body jerking slightly, but he didn't go down. Eric. He stood near the trailer, holding something. Zach's shotgun. I didn't even know Zach had one, but right now, I didn't care. Eric pumped it again. Move, Ryan. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran. The killer twitched, like he was debating coming after me, but Eric fired again. This time, the guy let out a guttural snarl, staggering backward before disappearing into the trees. Not dead, just gone. I collapsed near the trailer, sucking in deep, shaky breaths. Logan was nowhere to be seen. The coward had run. Eric stood there, his hands trembling around the shotgun, his face pale. For a second, neither of us spoke. The rain pounded against the metal trailer, the wind howling through the trees like laughter. "We need to go," Eric finally said. His voice was hoarse. I nodded. No argument. We grabbed whatever we could, hopped in the truck, and gunned it out of there. Didn't matter that the roads were bad. Didn't matter that the truck nearly slid into a ditch twice. We just kept driving. By the time we hit a town, it was nearly morning. We went straight to the sheriff's office, told them everything. They sent out a search team. They found Zach's body. They found the crashed truck. But they didn't find him. The man in the woods. No tracks. No blood. Nothing. Like he'd just vanished. And Logan? They found him too. Miles away, walking down a highway, waving down cars like nothing had happened. He didn't even look ashamed. Didn't apologize. Just stared at me, blank-faced, when we finally made eye contact. I didn't say a word to him. I never have since. My name's Ryan Jacob Carter. I'm 27 years old, and I'm from Denver, Colorado, born and raised. I'm one of those guys who grew up loving the outdoors, but not in a hardcore survivalist way. More like, I enjoy a good weekend hike. I own way too many flannel shirts, and I can pitch a tent without embarrassing myself. I work in IT, which means I spend way too much time indoors, staring at screens, so when I get the chance to unplug and get some fresh air, I take it. This trip? It was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my two best friends, Mark and Tyler, both of them as unprepared for what happened as I was. We had been talking about this trip for weeks. Tyler found this so-called hidden gem of a campsite in Northern California, tucked away in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Supposedly, it was secluded, barely touched, and absolutely beautiful. That's what he kept saying. Dude, it's untouched wilderness. We'll have the place to ourselves. That should have been the first red flag. Places that are untouched are usually that way for a reason. But at the time, all I cared about was a weekend away from emails and the never-ending grind of modern life. The drive itself was already a mission. We took my old Ford Bronco, which I swear is held together by sheer luck at this point, and it was hours of winding mountain roads, barely their cell service, and the kind of isolation that makes you question if you should have left a note behind. By the time we reached the turnoff, it was nothing more than a narrow dirt path leading deep into the woods. Not a single sign, not a single other car. Just us, three guys, a packed cooler, and an excitement that would soon turn into something much, much worse. Setting up camp was easy enough. We found a clearing by a small lake, completely surrounded by towering pines. It was the kind of place that should have felt peaceful, but something was just off. The air was too still, like the forest was holding its breath. But I shrugged it off. Overthinking. That's all it was. We got the tents up, gathered firewood, cracked open some beers, and settled in. Mark started joking about bears, which, yeah, funny at first, but the deeper we got into the conversation, the more I started to realize none of us really knew what the hell we were doing. The first night was normal, or at least we thought it was. We made a fire, grilled some burgers, and sat around drinking, talking about stupid things, work, relationships, how Tyler's ex was still messaging him despite the fact that she was engaged now. We laughed, we cursed, we felt invincible. Out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and open sky, it was easy to forget about the world. But what we didn't realize was that something else was out there too. Watching. I woke up sometime after midnight. Not because of a noise. There was no noise. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the woods were silent. And I mean completely silent. No wind, no rustling, no crickets. Just that unnatural kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I sat up, trying to shake off the grogginess, and that's when I noticed it. Tyler's tent was open. I figured he just got up to take a piss. No big deal. I laid back down, trying to convince myself that nothing was weird. But sleep didn't come easy. Something about that silence, it wasn't normal. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but my brain was trying to play it cool. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes. Morning came, and everything seemed fine. Tyler was back, snoring like a damn chainsaw in his tent. Mark was already up, making coffee over the fire. The forest was alive again, birds chirping, wind rustling the leaves, like nothing had happened. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Maybe I was being paranoid. That's what I told myself. And for a few hours, I actually believed it. But then we found the footprints. At first, we thought they were ours. The footprints, I mean. But the more we looked, the less sense that made. They were too big, and the stride was too long. Whoever left them had a serious height advantage. And here's the part that really got under my skin. They weren't just randomly scattered. They circled our camp. Once. Then vanished into the trees. No sign of whoever made them. No return tracks. Just a perfect loop around us, like someone, or something, had been watching. Tyler, still half asleep and cranky as hell, brushed it off. Probably a hunter, he said, stretching. Or some other camper just messing with us. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But Mark? He wasn't buying it either. What kind of hunter walks around barefoot? He muttered, pointing to one of the prints. No shoe tread. No boot marks. Just a deep, human-shaped print in the dirt. That's when I noticed something else. The fire pit. We'd left it burning low when we crashed. But now, it looked tampered with. Like someone had kicked dirt over it. Not enough to put it out, but enough to smother the flames. We argued about it for a bit, but in the end, we stayed. Because that's what idiots in horror stories do, right? But to be fair, what were we supposed to do? Pack up and leave just because of some weird footprints? It felt stupid. So we brushed it off, convinced ourselves it was nothing, and went about our day. But that feeling, that itch in the back of my skull telling me we weren't alone, it never really went away. We went on a hike later that afternoon, hoping to find some good views and maybe shake off the weirdness. The trail was rough, overgrown, definitely not a well-traveled spot. But after about an hour, we found something we weren't supposed to find. A cabin, or at least what was left of one. It looked ancient, half-collapsed, overgrown with moss, like the forest itself was trying to swallow it. The roof had caved in, the walls were warped and rotting, and there were bones scattered around the front. Not animal bones. Too big for that. We didn't get close enough to inspect, but just the sight of them was enough. All right, I'm done, Mark muttered, turning back. Tyler laughed, but it was forced. Dude, it's just an old hunter's cabin. But even he didn't want to stick around. The air was thick there, like the world was holding its breath again. Like something was waiting. We left fast. Too fast. And the whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd woken something up. Back at camp, things felt different. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and that uneasy silence? It was back. Stronger this time. Even the birds had stopped. We built the fire bigger than before, like that'd somehow keep whatever was out there away. We told jokes, drank more, tried to act normal. But then came the smell. It rolled in slow, like a rotting breeze, sour and wet. Something dead. Mark was the first to gag, covering his nose. Jesus, what is that? None of us had an answer. But as we sat there, gagging, looking around, the firelight caught something just past the tree line. A shape. Tall. Too tall. Standing between the trees. And then it moved. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fire flickered, the shadows shifted, and for a second, I almost convinced myself it was just an illusion. But then it moved again. Not like an animal, not like a person. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Tyler and Mark must have seen it too, because both of them went dead silent. No jokes, no nervous laughter. Just three grown men staring into the trees, trying to make sense of the thing watching us. Then, in the firelight, I saw its eyes. Low to the ground at first, like it was crouching. But when it rose, Jesus, it just kept going. Taller than any person should be. Limbs too long, too thin. And the way it stood there, not hiding, not afraid, just watching. like it was waiting for something. My stomach twisted, my skin crawled, and every instinct I had was screaming run. Nobody moved. We just sat there, frozen. Then Mark, either the bravest or dumbest of us, grabbed his flashlight and aimed it right at the thing. And that's when it really moved. Fast. Too fast for something that size. 1 second, it was at the edge of the trees. The next, it was gone. No footsteps, no breaking branches. Just gone. For a long minute, we didn't say a word. Tyler was breathing hard, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Mark nodded, gripping his flashlight so tight his knuckles turned white. I just swallowed hard and stood up. "We need to leave." Nobody argued. We grabbed whatever we could, backpacks, boots, my car keys, and moved toward the Bronco. But as soon as we stepped away from the fire, that smell came back. Stronger. Closer. My eyes watered. It was like breathing in rotting meat and wet earth. And then we heard it. A sound I'll never forget. Laughter. Not normal laughter. Not human. It started low, almost like a growl, then stretched into something distorted, broken, like it was trying to copy us, trying to sound human. But it wasn't. It was wrong. It was coming from the trees. From multiple directions. Something was toying with us. And then, just like that, the forest erupted. Branches snapped. Leaves whipped in all directions. Something was moving fast, too fast, circling us, closing in. That was it. That was the moment we ran. But we didn't all make it to the car. Mark was the fastest. He bolted straight for the Bronco without looking back. I was right behind him, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of them. But Tyler? Tyler wasn't with us. I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. He was still by the fire, frozen, like his body just refused to move. His eyes were locked on something, something just beyond the tree line. Tyler moved. I screamed, but he didn't. He just stood there, mouth slightly open, face pale, like he wasn't even in his own body anymore. And then, the laughter came again. Closer. Louder. A horrible, garbled sound that made my skin feel too tight. The trees behind him shifted, and I saw it. Tall, wrong, moving toward him with those unnatural, jerky motions. It was reaching for him. I don't remember making the decision. I just ran, sprinting back, grabbing his arm, yanking him so hard I nearly dislocated his shoulder. He snapped out of it with a gasping breath, like he'd been drowning, and finally, he ran. The moment his feet left that spot, something lunged. Not a person, not an animal, but something in between. I didn't see its face. I didn't want to. But I saw its fingers. Long, bony. Wrong. We barely made it to the car. Mark had the passenger door open, screaming at us to move faster. I practically shoved Tyler inside before diving into the driver's seat, my fingers slipping over the keys as I tried to jam them into the ignition. The forest exploded behind us. Branches cracking. Footsteps. Too many, too fast. That smell filling the air, so thick I could taste it. The engine sputtered. Didn't start. Mark was cursing, pounding the dash. Tyler was in the back, crying, actually crying, and I didn't blame him. I turned the key again, praying to anyone, anything, and then the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the Bronco lurched forward, tires kicking up dirt as we tore down the path. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but Mark did. I'll never forget the way his face changed. The way his eyes went wide, his mouth just slightly open, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He didn't scream. He didn't say a word. But when I stole a glance in the rearview mirror, I understood. The trees behind us were moving. Not swaying, not bending in the wind, moving. Like something massive was crashing through them, keeping pace with us. And in the center of it all, those eyes. Watching. Unblinking. We didn't stop. Not for hours. Not until we saw the first sign of civilization again. And even then, none of us spoke. Because no matter how far we drove, no matter how much distance we put between us and that forest, I could still hear it. The laughter. We made it back to civilization just before dawn, pulling into some rundown gas station on the outskirts of Redding. The Bronco was covered in dirt and scratches, like something had tried to grab it mid-escape. None of us got out right away. We just sat there, breathing heavy, hands still shaking. It wasn't until the gas station attendant knocked on the window that we snapped out of it. We must have looked insane. Mark got out first. Said he needed a minute to breathe, but I think he just didn't want to be in that car anymore. Tyler didn't move. He just sat in the back seat, staring at nothing, his face hollow, like part of him never left that forest. And me? I just gripped the steering wheel, trying to convince myself we were actually safe. We didn't call the cops. What the hell were we supposed to say? Hey, officer, there's a thing in the woods, super tall, smells like death, laughs like a broken radio? No, nobody would believe us. Hell, I barely believed us. But we knew one thing for sure. We were never going back there. Tyler was the first to break. He quit his job a week later, moved back home to Texas, and stopped answering our calls. I don't blame him. Whatever happened that night, whatever that thing was, it got inside his head. It did something to him. The last time I saw him, he looked like a ghost of himself. Sunken eyes, jumping at every sound, muttering things I didn't understand. Then one day, he just disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation. I tried to find him, but it was like he never existed. Mark and I, we made a pact. No talking about it. No telling anyone. We barely even saw each other after that. A few texts here and there, but nothing real. I think we both knew. If we started talking about it, if we let it back into our minds, it would come back. But here's the thing. It never really left. Some nights, when I'm alone, I hear it. Faint at first, almost like my brain is making it up. A low, garbled chuckle drifting through the dark. I tell myself it's just the wind, just my imagination. But deep down, I know better. Because last week, I woke up to my bedroom window standing wide open. The screen torn. The smell of rotting earth lingering in the air. And in the dirt beneath the window, a footprint. My name's Daniel Anthony Ruiz. I'm 30 years old, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I've spent most of my life in the desert, where the worst thing you have to worry about is the heat, dehydration, or maybe stepping on a rattlesnake if you're unlucky. Camping? Yeah, I've done my fair share, but nothing too crazy. State parks, designated campsites, places where there's at least a chance of bumping into other people if something goes wrong. That's why when my cousin, Eddie, invited me on this real camping trip in Northern California, I figured, why not? It was me, Eddie, and his longtime friend, James, a guy I didn't know too well, but had hung out with a couple of times. The plan was simple. Drive out to the Six Rivers National Forest, camp for the weekend, and just unplug from life for a while. Eddie made it sound like paradise. Bro, it's deep in the woods, right by this river. No people, no noise, just nature. That should have been my first clue, but at the time, it sounded perfect. I needed the break. The drive was brutal. Hours of highway, then dirt roads so bumpy I was sure my truck was going to fall apart. But eventually, we made it. And damn, I'll admit, it was beautiful. Dense trees, crisp air, a river so clear you could see the rocks at the bottom. It felt untouched, like we were the first people to ever set foot there. That was the feeling at first. But later, that untouched feeling would turn into something else. We set up camp on a patch of high ground near the river. 2 tents, a fire pit, the works. Everything seemed fine, normal even. We spent the first few hours fishing, drinking, and just messing around. It felt like any other camping trip. But then, as the sun started setting, I noticed something. There was a weird silence in the woods. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels wrong. Like the whole forest was listening. The birds, the bugs, even the sound of the river. It all seemed distant. I told myself I was overthinking it. But then James, who'd been goofing off all day, got quiet too. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, looking toward the trees. "Hear what?" Eddie said, cracking open another beer. James frowned. "I dunno. Thought I heard breathing." I laughed it off. Eddie did too. But something about the way James said it stuck with me. The dude looked genuinely uneasy. And looking back, we should have listened to him. Because that night, as we sat around the fire, telling stories and drinking, we weren't alone. That first night should have been peaceful. We had a fire going, the stars were out, and the air was crisp, perfect camping weather. But there was this feeling, like the woods were too still. Eddie and I kept the conversation going, trying to ignore it, but James? He was different. Jumpy. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he expected something to be standing there. At some point, he just muttered, "I swear I heard footsteps." Eddie rolled his eyes. "Dude, it's a forest. Probably a deer." James didn't look convinced. Then where the hell are the noises? No crickets, no owls, no nothing. I hadn't thought about it until then, but he was right. The normal sounds of the woods? Gone. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. But what were we supposed to do? Pack up and leave because of a weird vibe? It didn't make sense. So we stayed. Sometime after midnight, Eddie passed out, snoring in his tent. I was still sitting by the fire, half drunk, when James nudged me. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath. And then, I heard it too. Something was moving out there. Slow, deliberate steps, just beyond the firelight. Not an animal. Too heavy. James and I just sat there, frozen, staring into the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the second the beam hit, the footsteps stopped. That was enough for me. All right, man. I'm turning in. I wasn't going to sit there all night, waiting for some imaginary thing to show itself. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and forced myself to sleep. At some point, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned low, just soft embers glowing through the fabric of my tent. Then I heard it, right outside, breathing, deep, slow, like something big was standing just inches from my tent. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to call out to Eddie or James, but something in my gut told me not to. Not to move, not to make a sound. So I just lay there, barely breathing, listening as whatever was out there just stood there. Minutes passed. Then, finally, footsteps. Slow, crunching in the dirt, moving away from my tent. Toward James's. I should have said something. Should have warned him. But I didn't. And the next morning, James was gone. At first, I thought James had just gone to take a piss. His boots were gone, his jacket too, so it wasn't like he wandered off naked or anything. But as the minutes stretched and he didn't come back, that uneasy feeling in my gut started turning into something worse. Dread. Eddie wasn't even awake yet, still dead asleep in his tent. I stepped outside, rubbing the stiffness out of my neck, and that's when I saw it. James's footprints leading away from camp. Only something about them was wrong. They weren't just footprints. They were dragged. Like he'd taken a few normal steps, and then something took him. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. They led toward the trees, past the edge of our camp, into the deeper woods where the light barely reached. That's where I stopped, because right at the tree line, where the dirt turned to thick forest floor, James's footprints just ended, like he had been lifted straight off the ground. That's when I heard it. Something moving above me. I tilted my head back, scanning the branches. Nothing. Just shifting leaves, the early morning breeze stirring the trees. But then, a creak. Not the sound of wind. The sound of weight. Something heavy. Something watching. A sharp snap behind me made me whirl around. Eddie was standing there, groggy, rubbing his eyes. "The hell you doing, man?" His voice was thick with sleep, like he didn't realize James was missing yet. I opened my mouth to answer, but something made me stop. That silence was back. Heavy. Suffocating. And then, just at the edge of my hearing, laughter. Low. Broken. Like it was coming from something that had never laughed before. I grabbed Eddie by the arm. "James is gone," I hissed. His face twisted in confusion. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" I didn't answer. I just pointed at the tracks. The way they just stopped. Eddie stared at them, then back at me, his sleepy expression draining into something serious. "Dude, what the fuck?" We weren't alone. We never were. The trees around us felt too full, too dense, like something was in them, waiting, shifting just out of sight. I didn't know what to do. My gut was screaming to run, get the hell out of there. But James, we couldn't just leave him. Then the laughter came again, closer this time. And the worst part? It sounded like James. For a second, neither of us moved. We just stood there, listening to that twisted, broken laughter echo through the trees. It sounded almost like James, but not quite. Like something was trying to mimic him and getting it just slightly wrong. Then came the sound of footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Coming straight for us. "Run." I didn't even think. I just grabbed Eddie and bolted toward camp. He didn't argue. We sprinted back to the tents, my heart slamming against my ribs. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely rip open my tent flap to grab my keys. Eddie was already yanking stuff out of his bag. "Where's the knife? Where the hell is my knife?" His voice was frantic. I didn't answer. I was too busy listening. Because whatever was out there, it had stopped running. The woods were dead silent again. No laughter. No footsteps. Just the two of us, gasping for air by the smoldering fire pit, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. Then, a whisper. Right behind me. Danny, help me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. That voice. It was James's voice. I swear to God, it was his exact voice. But the thing standing at the edge of the trees? It wasn't James. It was tall. Wrong. It had his shape, his build, but something about it was off. Its head tilted, like it wasn't used to its own body. And even though I couldn't see its face, I knew. It was looking right at me. Then it moved. Not like a person, like a puppet being yanked on strings. Its limbs jerked, twitched, bending in ways they shouldn't as it took an unnatural step toward us. I lost it. I scrambled for my keys, fumbling, dropping them into the dirt. Eddie yanked me up by my jacket. Go, go. We sprinted for my truck. I could hear it following. Fast. Too fast. The ground trembled with every step it took, and I swear, I could hear it breathing. Right behind me. I dove into the driver's seat, Eddie barely getting the door shut before I turned the key. The truck roared to life. Headlights flooded the trees. And for a split second, just before I hit the gas, I saw it. A face. Not James's face. Not anymore. Something else. Something wearing him. Then I slammed my foot down on the pedal, and we tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and rocks as we flew down the road. I didn't dare look in the mirror. I didn't want to know if it was still chasing us. Eddie was gripping the dash, panting. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But I know one thing for sure. That wasn't James. We didn't stop driving. Not for hours. Not until we hit a main road and saw the first gas station in miles. Even then, I didn't pull over right away. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles white, my foot pressing the gas like that thing was still right behind us. Eddie was shaking, his breath ragged. Neither of us had spoken since we left. What was there to say? That we'd seen something impossible. That James was gone, taken by something wearing his face. The second I stopped the truck outside the gas station, Eddie jumped out, hands on his knees, throwing up onto the pavement. I just sat there, staring at the road ahead. My brain wouldn't stop replaying it. That face in the headlights. The way it moved. How it called my name in James's voice. We should have called the cops. We should have reported James missing. But what the hell were we supposed to tell them? That something took him? That we ran like cowards? We knew exactly how that would go. They'd think we killed him. Or that he wandered off drunk. Either way, we were screwed. So we did nothing. Eddie packed up and left the next day. Back to LA, back to his life. I don't blame him. He wanted to forget. I tried to do the same. Went back to work, back to normal. But normal was gone. Because a week later, I got a text. From James. At least, that's what the name on my phone said. But the message? Just a single word. Danny. I stared at it for a long time, my skin crawling. Then my phone buzzed again. A photo this time. A forest. Thick trees. And in the middle, barely visible in the shadows, a figure. Tall. Wrong. Watching. I blocked the number. Threw my phone across the room like that would make a difference. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Faint. Distant. Laughter. And I swear to God, it sounded like James. My name is Elliot Maxwell Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in the city, surrounded by rain, coffee shops, and people who think a weekend hike makes them outdoor experts. I'm one of them. I love nature, but I don't pretend to be a survivalist. I camp a couple times a year, always with friends, always in places where I know I can get back to civilization if needed. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was me, my girlfriend Lena, and my best friend Caleb. We'd been planning it for a while, a weekend camping trip in Lassen National Forest, Northern California. Lena found the spot online, some off-the-grid location near a hot spring. No crowds, no distractions, she'd said. Caleb was on board immediately. Me? I liked the idea, but something about no distractions made me uneasy. No distractions meant no help if things went south. But I ignored that feeling. Because why wouldn't I? It was just camping. We left early Friday morning, making the 10-hour drive down from Seattle. The last stretch was brutal, long dirt roads, no signs, no phone service. But eventually we found it. A small clearing near the hot springs, surrounded by towering pines, completely untouched. No other campers, no signs of people. It was exactly what Lena wanted. That first day was perfect. We set up the tents, explored a bit, and even took a dip in the hot springs. The water was warm, steaming in the cool mountain air. The isolation? It felt like freedom. No traffic, no notifications, just us and nature. But that night, things changed. It started with something small. Caleb swore he saw someone standing in the trees. Lena laughed it off. We're literally in the middle of nowhere. Who would be out here? But Caleb wasn't joking. And the look in his eyes when he said it, that stuck with me. Because later that night, when I was lying in the tent, half asleep, I heard it too. The sound of footsteps. Not close, not aggressive, just circling our camp. Slow, deliberate, like someone was waiting. I didn't move at first. Just lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening. The footsteps were soft, barely more than a crunch in the dirt. But they weren't random. They were measured, pacing in a slow, deliberate circle. I held my breath, waiting to hear Caleb or Lena react, but their tents were silent. Either they were asleep, or they were lying still like I was. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone else was awake, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I reached for my phone. No service. Of course. I checked the time, 2:46 a.m. Then, the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No crunching dirt, no shifting leaves. Just silence. And for some reason, that was worse. Because now, I had no idea where they were. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every little sound had me on edge, and when the sun finally started creeping through the trees, I was the first one up. Caleb crawled out of his tent a few minutes later, yawning. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. He rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, I thought I heard someone walking around." He gave me a look. "You saw it too, right?" I hesitated. "Saw what?" Caleb's face tensed. I woke up and looked outside. I swear, I saw someone standing by the trees, just watching. I didn't know what to say, because the way he said it, the way his voice dropped, told me one thing for sure. He wasn't messing around. Lena woke up a little later, stretching, totally unaware. "What's up with you guys?" she asked, glancing between us. I debated telling her, but Caleb beat me to it. "We think there was someone near camp last night." She frowned. "You mean an animal?" No, his voice was flat. "Serious. A person." Lena glanced at the trees, then shook her head. "You guys are being paranoid." Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just our imaginations. But when we went to check around camp, we found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not hiking boots. Bare feet. Circling our tents. And they weren't ours. I stared at the footprints, my brain scrambling for a normal explanation, but there wasn't one. They were too big to be Lena's, too narrow to be mine or Caleb's. And the way they circled our camp, slow and deliberate, that sent a chill through me. Someone had been watching us. Lena let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, yeah, that's weird. But maybe a hiker passed through. At 2 in the morning?" Caleb shot back. "With bare feet." Lena didn't answer, just hugged herself, suddenly looking way less sure of herself. That's when we noticed something else. The fire pit. We'd let the embers burn low before going to sleep, but now it was completely covered in dirt, like someone had tried to erase it, to make it look like we were never here. Caleb and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but we were thinking the same thing. Whoever left those footprints, they wanted us gone. I checked my phone again. Still no service. The truck was parked about a mile away, up the dirt road we came in on. "We should leave," I muttered. Lena's eyes snapped to me. "What?" "No. We just got here." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking torn. "I mean, maybe we're overreacting." He didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. I wanted to leave. Everything in me was screaming to leave. But in the end, we stayed. And that was our biggest mistake. We tried to shake it off, spent the afternoon hiking, forcing ourselves to act normal. But that night, as we sat around the fire, something changed. It started with a sound. Not footsteps this time. Something deeper. A low, guttural noise drifting through the trees. Almost like a hum. Lena went still. "What is that?" Caleb shook his head. "I don't know." His voice was barely above a whisper. The humming grew louder. A vibrating, unnatural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt it in my chest, in my teeth. It made my stomach churn. Then, just beyond the firelight, something moved. Not an animal. Not a person. Something else. And it was watching us. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We just sat there, frozen, staring at the place where the firelight faded into darkness. The humming hadn't stopped. It had settled into this low, pulsing vibration, like the forest itself was alive, breathing with us. Then it stepped forward. The firelight barely reached it, but I saw enough. A figure, tall and thin, but wrong. Its arms were too long, its neck too crooked, like it had been stretched into something almost human, but not quite. And its face, Jesus. It was featureless, smooth and pale, like something that had never needed eyes, never needed a mouth. Lena gasped. Caleb grabbed my arm. Go, he whispered. I didn't argue. We moved at the same time, all three of us sprinting for the tents, for our bags, for anything. But as soon as I reached my tent, I heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Coming straight for us. I grabbed my keys and my flashlight, whipping around just in time to see Caleb trip over the firewood pile. He went down hard, cursing. Get up. Lena shrieked, grabbing his arm. The humming turned into a screech. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We tore through the woods, running blind, my flashlight bouncing wildly, barely lighting the uneven path. The truck was a mile away, a full mile of pitch-black forest between us and safety. Behind us, branches snapped. It was chasing us. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop. I could see the dirt road ahead, the faint gleam of my truck's windows reflecting in the moonlight. So close. Then Caleb screamed. I skidded to a stop, nearly falling. Caleb, he was gone. 1 second, he was running next to me. The next, nothing. Lena was sobbing, yanking at my arm. We have to go. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the dark trees where Caleb had been. And then, he stepped out. At least, something that looked like him. Caleb stood there, just a few feet from where he had disappeared. But something about him was off. His stance was too stiff, his arms hanging limply at his sides. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see that his face looked wrong. His expression was blank, like someone had hit pause on his emotions. But the worst part? His eyes. They were empty, lifeless, like whatever had grabbed him had left behind a shell, a copy. Caleb. My voice cracked. He didn't answer. He just took a single step forward. The movement was too smooth, too calculated, like he was testing his own body. Lena dug her nails into my wrist. That's not him, she whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to argue, wanted to believe that somehow he had just gotten turned around. But deep down, I knew she was right. Something had taken him, and now it was wearing him. Then he spoke, or tried to. Elliot. My name came out distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The sound of it sent a violent shiver up my spine. It wasn't Caleb's voice. Not really. It was something trying to be Caleb. I took a slow step back, my heartbeat slamming in my ears. The thing wearing my friend cocked its head, studying me. Then it tried again. Elliot, help me. The words were better this time, smoother. It was learning. I broke. I turned and ran, dragging Lena with me. The truck was only yards away now. So close. Behind us, I could hear the thing moving, its footsteps unnaturally light for something that had to be Caleb's size. But I didn't look back. I wouldn't. If I saw its face again, really saw it, I don't think I would have made it out of those woods. I fumbled with my keys as we reached the truck, my hands slick with sweat. Dropped them. My stomach clenched. Shit. Lena snatched them up before I could, shoving them into my palm. I barely managed to jam the key into the lock, wrenching the door open. Get in. I didn't need to tell her twice. She dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as I turned the ignition. The truck roared to life. Headlights flooded the trees. And standing at the edge of the woods, Caleb, or what was left of him. His mouth was stretched too wide, his arms hanging in an unnatural, twisted way. Waiting. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, launching us forward. Trees blurred past as we sped down the road, the forest disappearing behind us. But even as we put distance between ourselves and that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever was out there, let us go. And that scared me more than anything. We didn't stop driving until we reached Redding. By then, the sun was rising, but I didn't feel any relief. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, my body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? That we had watched Caleb disappear? That something had replaced him? Who the hell would believe us? We sat in the parking lot of a gas station, staring out the windshield, trying to process the impossible. Lena left the next day, said she was going home to be with her family, that she needed time to forget. I didn't blame her. I wanted to forget too, but I couldn't, because 2 days later, I got a text from Caleb's number. Just 2 words, "Where are you?" My stomach twisted. I wanted to ignore it, but then my phone buzzed again. A picture. My apartment building, taken from across the street. I haven't gone home since, but I know one thing. It's still out there. And now, it knows my name. My name is Nathaniel Nate Joseph Harris. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in construction, nothing fancy, but it pays the bills. I've always liked the outdoors, not in a hardcore, survivalist kind of way, but enough that I try to go on at least a couple of camping trips every year. Nothing beats getting away from the noise of the city, drinking a few beers around the fire, and just disconnecting from everything. That's exactly what this trip was supposed to be. It was me, my younger brother Zach, and his best friend Ryan. Zach is 24, way more adventurous than I am, always pushing for more extreme trips, deeper hikes, rougher terrain, riskier locations. He was the one who picked this place, some isolated spot in the Klamath National Forest, Northern California. I'd never been, but from the pictures, it looked amazing. Dense trees, a crystal clear lake, total seclusion. No tourists, no other campers, just us, Zach had said, practically buzzing with excitement. That should have been the first red flag. We left early on a Friday morning, loaded up Zach's truck, and made the drive south. The closer we got, the less I liked it. The roads got rougher, the signs disappeared, and my cell service cut out completely. By the time we turned off onto the last dirt road, it felt like we were heading somewhere we weren't supposed to go. But when we arrived, I'll admit, it was beautiful. A perfect, quiet clearing right by the water. We set up camp, cracked a few beers, and just enjoyed being off the grid. The first couple of hours were perfect. Swimming, fishing, joking around. I actually started to relax. Then, as the sun started dipping below the trees, we heard it. A single, sharp whistle. Not a bird. Not the wind. A person. And it came from deep in the woods. At first, none of us moved. We just sat there, listening, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Just the crackling fire, the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. I told myself it was probably just some distant hiker, someone passing through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Hikers don't go that deep without a trail. And they don't just whistle once and stop. Ryan was the first to speak. You guys heard that, right? He was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in his voice. Zach, always the brave one, shrugged. Yeah, probably nothing. But he didn't sound convinced either. We waited a few more minutes, listening, but the whistle never came again. Eventually, we forced ourselves to relax, chalking it up to our imaginations. But after that, the vibe had shifted. We weren't joking as much, weren't as comfortable. I kept catching Ryan glancing at the trees, like he expected someone to step out at any second. I felt it too, that strange sense that something was off. The woods around us didn't feel empty anymore. They felt occupied, like we weren't alone. We tried to shake it off, ate our dinner, had another beer, and forced ourselves to act normal. But then Ryan stood up suddenly, his eyes locked on something past the fire. What? I asked. He didn't answer right away, just narrowed his eyes, staring into the shadows. I swear to God, I saw movement. Zach exhaled loudly, shaking his head. Dude, it's probably just a deer. But Ryan wasn't convinced. Neither was I. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trunks and undergrowth. No movement. No eyes reflecting the light back at us. Just trees. Silent and still. I let out a slow breath. See? Nothing. But I wasn't so sure. We should have left right then. Packed up, thrown everything in the truck, and got the hell out of there. But instead, we convinced ourselves we were just being paranoid. We're too far in to leave now, Zach said, tossing another log onto the fire. Let's just chill. I didn't like it. Not one bit. But I nodded anyway. What else could I do? The night dragged on, slow and uneasy. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I tensed up. Every time the fire crackled, I flinched. I kept expecting to hear that whistle again, but it never came. Maybe that should have made me feel better. It didn't. Because whatever had made that sound, it was still out there. At some point, we all went to bed, though I don't think any of us really slept. I lay there in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the forest. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet, too still, like the whole place was holding its breath. That's when I realized I couldn't hear the lake anymore. No water lapping, no gentle waves, just silence. And then, from right outside my tent, I heard footsteps. The footsteps weren't heavy. They weren't rushed. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was taking their time. My whole body locked up. I barely breathed, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. Right outside, just inches from the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I wanted to call out to Zach or Ryan, but my throat was too dry. My body refused to move. Something in my gut told me not to speak, not to make a single sound. I lay there, frozen, gripping my sleeping bag like that would somehow protect me. The footsteps circled my tent once, then twice. Slow, steady, like whoever, or whatever, was out there was studying me. Then came the worst part. I heard it before I saw it. That soft, metallic whisper as the teeth slowly began to separate. Inch by inch, something was opening my tent. My heart slammed against my ribs. Do I move? Do I scream? Do I run? Every part of me was screaming, don't look. Don't look. But I couldn't help myself. I turned my head, and there, just beyond the opening flap, a face, or at least something that was trying to be a face. The firelight cast flickering shadows over stretched skin, hollow eyes, a mouth that was too wide. It was grinning at me, a grin that didn't belong on a human face. My body finally kicked into action. I threw myself backward, kicking at the fabric, scrambling away from that thing. I crashed into the back of my tent, gasping for air. The zipper stopped. For a long, horrible second, it was silent. Just me and that thing, both waiting. Then, without warning, the flap snapped shut, like it had never moved at all. The footsteps started again, slow and unhurried, walking away. I finally found my voice. Zach, Ryan. My voice cracked, shaking. I scrambled out of my tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I pointed it around. Nothing. No movement. No sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. Zach and Ryan stumbled out of their tents, blinking in confusion. What the hell, man? Zach groaned. I was panting, sweating. I could barely get the words out. Something, it was outside my tent. Ryan looked around, shining his own flashlight into the trees. There's nothing here. I shook my head. No, it was here. It opened my tent. Zach frowned. Then where'd it go? I didn't have an answer, because as I turned my flashlight toward the ground, something made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not ours. The zipper on my tent started to move, and they led into the woods. The footprints were fresh, deep. They started right outside my tent and led straight into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. But they weren't normal. The strides were too long, the shape too narrow, like whoever, or whatever, had made them wasn't walking right. Zach followed the trail with his flashlight, his face pale. Dude, these aren't ours. No one argued. We knew they weren't. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched. Stronger than ever. My skin crawled. We need to go? Now. Ryan shook his head. Man, it's the middle of the night. If we try to hike back to the truck, we could get lost. His voice was low, shaky. Whatever that thing was, it left. Maybe it's gone. But I didn't believe that. Zach exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. All right, we stay together. No one goes off alone. I nodded, my hand still shaking. Let's pack up. Fast. We moved quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs, never taking our eyes off the trees. Every sound, the rustling wind, the snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. It felt like we were being hunted. Then, from the woods, the whistle. Louder this time. Closer. That same sharp, deliberate sound, echoing through the trees. Zach's breath hitched. Nope. Not doing this. He grabbed his pack and bolted toward the path. I wasn't far behind. Ryan hesitated, his flashlight beam shaking. Guys, wait. But then, something moved. A shadow, tall, thin, shifting between the trees. It was watching us. I didn't wait. Run. My legs burned as we sprinted up the narrow dirt path, branches whipping against my arms. I could hear something behind us, moving fast. Too fast. Leaves rustled, footsteps crashed, and that damn whistling followed us, weaving through the trees like a warning. We reached the clearing where the truck was parked. Almost there. Zach yanked open the driver's side door, but his hands were shaking too hard to get the keys in the ignition. Come on, come on. Ryan was still behind me, panting hard. Did you see that thing? I didn't answer, because I didn't want to. Then I heard it, rustling, directly behind us. I turned, my stomach flipping. Something was standing at the tree line, just beyond the glow of the headlights. Too tall, too still. But the worst part? It wasn't just one. There were more. Figures, lined up between the trees. Watching, waiting. The engine roared to life. Zach slammed the gas, and the tires spun against the dirt. The headlights cut through the figures, but as soon as the light touched them, they vanished. Just gone. We peeled out onto the road, speeding into the night, leaving whatever the hell that was behind us. But as we drove, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The whistling? It never stopped. We didn't stop driving. Not for miles. The forest blurred past in the darkness, the truck bouncing over rough roads, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. Zach's hands were locked on the wheel, white-knuckled, his foot pressing the gas like that thing was still right behind us. Ryan sat in the back, head down, breathing hard. None of us spoke. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we hit pavement. A real road. The sight of it almost made me cry. Zach didn't slow down until we reached the first gas station in some tiny town I didn't even catch the name of. He pulled into the lot and killed the engine, but none of us moved. We just sat there, staring ahead, letting our brains catch up to what just happened. Ryan was the first to break the silence. We saw that, right? His voice was hoarse, like he barely believed the words coming out of his mouth. Zach exhaled shakily, rubbing his face. I don't know what we saw, man. But I did. We all did. There was something in those woods, and it had been waiting for us. I forced myself to get out of the truck, stretching my shaking legs. The air felt too open, too exposed. I wanted walls around me, lights, people. Zach followed, leaning against the hood, still gripping the keys like he was afraid someone would take them. We should tell someone, I muttered. The cops. A ranger. Somebody. Ryan shook his head. And say what? Hey, officer, we got chased by. I don't even know what. He was right. What could we say? That something had been watching us all night? That we saw things that shouldn't exist? No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed us. We ended up sitting in that gas station parking lot for over an hour, just staring at nothing. Zach finally muttered, I'm never camping again. Ryan laughed, but it was hollow. Forced. We all knew this wasn't something we could just forget. Something out there had been waiting. Hunting. And we had barely made it out. We agreed not to talk about it. Not to tell our families, our friends. What good would it do? We'd sound insane. So we got back in the truck, drove back to Oregon, and tried to pretend it never happened. But things didn't go back to normal. Not really. I stopped going outside at night. Zach triple-locked his doors. And Ryan? Ryan stopped answering texts altogether. Then, a week later, I got a voicemail. No caller ID. Just static at first. And then, through the crackling distortion, I heard it. The whistle. Sharp. Deliberate. Closer than before. I hung up, my hands shaking. Tried to tell myself it was a prank, a coincidence. But when I played it back, the voicemail was gone. Like it had never been there. But I know what I heard. And I know one thing for sure. It's still watching. I'm Eric David Lawson. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Las Vegas, Nevada. If you know Vegas, you know the kind of life I'm used to: bright lights, packed streets, noise 24/7. I like the city, but sometimes it's too much. That's why every now and then, I need to get the hell out. Somewhere quiet, somewhere real. And nothing gets more real than the wilderness. That's how I ended up on this trip. It wasn't even my idea. That honor goes to my old friend Josh, the one who always thought he was the outdoors expert in our group. No matter what he did, he had to take it to the extreme. He didn't want some casual campsite. He wanted the deep woods experience. And for some reason, I agreed. So it was me, Josh, and his cousin Matt, heading out to a place so isolated it didn't even have an official name on most maps, somewhere in the Mendocino National Forest, Northern California. Josh had read about it in some forum, called it the most untouched, unspoiled camping spot you'll ever find. That should have been my first clue to say no. The drive took nearly 10 hours. Highways turned to back roads turned to dirt paths, until we were navigating through the middle of nowhere with no cell service. I remember looking out the window and realizing we were completely alone. No towns, no gas stations, not even a roadside stop. Just endless trees. We finally parked near an old, half-fallen ranger sign. No trail markers. No signs of other campers. Just us and the wild. Josh was thrilled. "This is perfect," he said. Matt was a little quieter, but I figured he was just tired from the drive. As for me, something about the place didn't sit right. But I kept my mouth shut. Setting up camp went fine. We built a fire, cooked some food, settled in. It was peaceful at first. But then, as the sky darkened, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. I've been camping before. I know what the woods are supposed to sound like. Crickets, owls, the wind shifting the trees. But here, nothing. No rustling leaves, no animal noises. Just a thick, heavy silence, like the entire forest was waiting for something. And then, somewhere in the distance, we heard it. A deep, rhythmic knocking. Not an echo, not an animal. Something deliberate. The knocking came in bursts of 3. Boom, boom, boom. Then silence. A few seconds later, boom, boom, boom. It wasn't woodpeckers. It wasn't trees shifting in the wind. It was too steady, too controlled. It sounded human. Josh, being Josh, was the first to react. "Probably some old hermit out here," he said, grinning. "We should go say hi." He was half joking, but I could tell he was curious. Matt and I weren't laughing. "It's getting dark," I muttered. "We don't need to be wandering around." Matt nodded. "We don't even know what direction it's coming from." That part was true. The sound seemed to move, like it wasn't coming from a fixed point. 1 second, it was distant. The next, closer. But every time we tried to pinpoint it, it stopped. That alone should have been enough to make us leave. But we didn't. Instead, we forced ourselves to ignore it. We spent the next hour trying to pretend nothing was wrong. We made dinner, sat around the fire, cracked open a couple of beers. But the mood was different now. Forced. Like we were all waiting for something to happen. I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. At one point, Josh stood up, stretched, and said, "I'm going to take a piss." He wandered off into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't like it, but I didn't say anything. We were grown men. No reason to freak out over a little weird knocking. Still, something about him walking into that silent forest made my stomach twist. A few minutes passed. Then we heard footsteps, coming back toward us. I relaxed a little. Josh. But when I turned to say something, he wasn't there. The footsteps kept coming. Steady. Slow. Just outside the firelight. Matt and I both froze, staring into the trees. The footsteps stopped. A long, awful silence stretched between us. Then boom, boom, boom. That same knocking sound. But this time, it was right behind us. Josh finally walked back into camp, zipping up his jacket. "What's with the faces?" he asked. We both spun to look at him. Matt's voice was tight. "Dude, was that you?" Josh frowned. "Was what me?" That's when we realized. He had come from the opposite direction of the footsteps. Josh looked at us like we were crazy, but Matt and I weren't speaking. We were still staring into the trees, trying to understand what just happened. We heard footsteps. We heard the knocking. But if Josh had come from the other direction, then who, or what, had been walking toward us? My skin crawled. "Guys." Josh's voice cut through the silence. "What's going on?" Matt finally turned to him, his face pale. "We heard someone. Walking. Right over there." He pointed past the fire. "It stopped when you showed up." Josh frowned, glancing between us and the trees. "You sure it wasn't an echo?" "It wasn't an echo. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much." But Josh, always the skeptic, just shook his head. "Whatever, man. You guys are acting weird." He grabbed another beer, sat down, and stretched out like nothing was wrong. But Matt and I weren't convinced. We knew what we heard. The rest of the night was tense. None of us slept right away. We just sat there, staring into the dark, listening. But the knocking didn't come back. The footsteps were gone. After a couple of hours, Josh started to nod off, and Matt eventually crawled into his tent. I stayed up the longest, watching the trees, trying to shake the feeling that something was still out there. At some point, I must have drifted off. Because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was breathing. Deep. Slow. Close. My entire body locked up. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Just lay there, staring at the thin fabric between me and whatever was outside. Then, my tent collapsed. I panicked, kicking at the fabric, tangled in my sleeping bag. The weight of it pressed down on me like something had pushed the whole thing over. I clawed my way out, gasping for air. The fire had burned low, casting just enough light to see that Matt's tent was flattened too. "Matt." My voice came out hoarse, shaky. No answer. I turned to Josh's tent, untouched. I ran over, yanking the zipper down. Empty. His bag was still inside. Josh was gone. Something moved near the tree line. A tall shape, standing just beyond the dying glow of the fire. My breath caught. It was watching me. Then, clear as day, I heard Josh's voice. But it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. Josh. But no, Josh wasn't there. Just darkness and trees. My chest tightened. I could still hear him. His voice. Right behind me. But the trees in front of me? That thing was still standing there. Still watching. Then it moved. Not like a person. Like something learning how to walk. Its limbs jerked, unnatural, too long, bending at the wrong angles. My breath caught. The thing in the trees? It wasn't Josh. But the voice behind me. It was trying to be. Matt's tent rustled. He was waking up. What's going on? His voice was groggy, confused. I wanted to tell him don't move, don't speak, just run. But it was too late. The moment he sat up, the thing in the trees twitched. A sudden, jerky motion, like it had been waiting for one of us to move. Waiting for an excuse. I didn't give it one. I grabbed Matt by the arm and yanked him to his feet. Run. That was all I got out before we both bolted. Straight for the truck. I didn't care what we left behind. The tents, the gear, none of it mattered. Josh was gone. We had to go. Behind us, I heard something running too. But not footsteps. Something heavier. Bigger. The air felt thick, buzzing, like the whole forest was alive. The truck was close. So close. I fumbled in my pocket, nearly dropping the keys. Get in. Get in. Get in. We yanked the doors open and threw ourselves inside. Locked them. The second my hands hit the wheel, something slammed against the back of the truck. Hard. The whole vehicle shook. Matt screamed. I didn't look. Didn't dare. I just turned the key, praying to every god I never believed in. The truck roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, spinning dirt and rocks as we lurched backward. I caught the briefest glimpse in the mirror, something tall, pale, moving back into the trees. Too fast. Too smooth. Like it had never been there at all. We hit the road, tearing through the night, speeding down winding dirt paths without thinking. My heart pounded, my vision blurred. Matt was sobbing, gripping the dashboard like we might flip at any second. But I didn't stop. Not until we saw the first sign of civilization. Even then, I didn't feel safe. Because somewhere out there, in those woods, in that impossible silence, Josh was still missing. And worse, something else had his voice. We didn't stop until we hit pavement. The truck skidded onto the main road, tires screeching, dirt flying. My hands were locked on the wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until we reached a gas station, bright and empty under the fluorescent lights. I parked and just sat there, frozen. Matt was shaking, staring straight ahead. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? That something took Josh. That we saw something? No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed us. The silence stretched until Matt finally muttered, "We should go back." His voice was hoarse, but serious. I whipped my head toward him. "Are you insane?" He swallowed hard. "We can't just leave him out there." My stomach twisted. I knew he was right. But the thought of going back to that place, back into the trees, every inch of my body screamed no. "Josh is gone," I whispered. "You saw that thing. Whatever it wasn't him." Matt didn't answer. He just looked down, gripping his knees. I could tell he didn't believe me. Or maybe he just didn't want to. Either way, we never went back. We left that gas station, drove south until we hit a motel, and spent the rest of the night locked inside, barely sleeping. The next morning, Matt called the police. They searched. For 3 days. They found our campsite, our gear, but no sign of Josh. No footprints leading away. Nothing. Eventually, they ruled it an accidental disappearance. Said he must have wandered off and gotten lost. But Matt and I knew better. Josh didn't wander off. A few weeks passed. Matt stopped talking to me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe he just couldn't handle the truth. I went back to Vegas, tried to pretend it never happened. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't finished with it, that it wasn't finished with us. Then, a month later, I got a text. From Josh's number. Just 2 words. Come back. I stared at the screen, my whole body going cold. I wanted to believe it was a sick joke. Some glitch. But then I noticed something. The timestamp. The message had been sent at 2:13 a.m. The exact time we left camp that night. I deleted it. Blocked the number. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Because a week later, I heard it. That same, deep knocking. 3 times. Coming from inside my house. My name is Marcus Ray Holloway. I'm 31 years old, and I live in San Antonio, Texas. I've always been a city guy, traffic, crowds, the kind of noise that never really stops. But every once in a while, I need a break. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far. That's how I got roped into this trip. A weekend camping in Sequoia National Forest, California. It sounded perfect. It was supposed to be me and my coworker Troy, but at the last minute, he invited his younger brother, Jason. I didn't mind. More people meant more safety, right? Looking back, that was a stupid thought. Nothing could have prepared us for what actually happened. We left on a Friday morning, flew into Fresno, rented a truck, and drove east into the mountains. The plan was simple. Find a secluded campsite, spend a couple of nights under the stars, and head back Sunday. Troy had picked the spot. Man, it's deep in the woods. No tourists, no people, just us. That should have been the first red flag. The last stretch of the drive was rough. Winding dirt roads, no cell service, no signs of life. By the time we reached the site, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The place was beautiful, though. Towering sequoias, thick forest, and absolute silence. Almost too silent. But I ignored the gnawing feeling in my gut. We set up camp, got a fire going, and cracked open a few beers. The first couple of hours were great. Laughing, talking, just enjoying the peace. But after the sun fully set, things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. The air got too still. No wind. No rustling branches. Just this heavy quiet, like the whole forest was waiting. Then Jason said something that made my skin crawl. Hey, does it feel like we're being watched? Troy laughed, tossed a stick into the fire. You scared of the dark already? But Jason wasn't joking. His eyes were locked on the tree line, his expression tense. No, man. I swear I saw something move. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. That deep, crawling unease, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching us. We should have left. Right then. But we didn't. Instead, we stayed up late, trying to pretend everything was normal. And then, just after midnight, I woke up to the sound of Jason screaming. Jason's scream cut through the night like a blade. I shot up so fast I nearly ripped my sleeping bag. Panic hit instantly. My brain was still groggy, trying to process where I was, what was happening. But then I heard him again. Help. Help me. His voice was shaking, desperate. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows over the camp. Troy was already up, his flashlight darting across the trees. Jason. No answer. Just the sound of heavy breathing. Close. Too close. Then, from the darkness, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not Jason's. They were heavier. Wrong. My stomach twisted. Where the hell is he? I hissed. Troy turned in circles, his face pale. He was right here. He went to take a piss. I heard him right before he screamed. I grabbed my flashlight, aimed it toward the trees. The beam caught something in the dirt, Jason's boots. Sitting there, side by side. Empty. I swallowed hard. No. No way. People don't just step out of their boots. They don't just vanish. Troy took a shaky step forward. Jason? Man, if this is a joke, it's not funny. He sounded unsure, like he already knew this wasn't a joke. The footsteps had stopped. The breathing had stopped. But the feeling that something was out there? Stronger than ever. I turned back to the tents, grabbed my knife. My whole body was on edge now. We have to find him. But my gut was screaming, don't go in there. Don't follow. I pushed the thought away. Jason was out there. We couldn't just leave him. Troy took the lead, flashlight shaking in his hand. We moved slowly into the trees, the light barely cutting through the thick darkness. Jason. My voice sounded too loud in the silence. Nothing. Just the sound of our own breathing, our own footsteps crunching over pine needles. Then we saw them. Footprints. Leading away from camp. Bare. No shoes. Too long. But here's the part that made my skin crawl. They weren't deep enough. Like whoever made them wasn't really walking. A branch snapped ahead. Close. My breath caught in my throat. And then, from the darkness, Jason's voice. Guys, I need help. But something was wrong. Jason's voice sounded flat. Off. Like he was struggling to say the words. Like he was testing them out for the first time. Troy took a shaky step forward, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Jason, where are you? The trees didn't answer. The footprints stopped just ahead of us, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. A shadow shifted between the trees. Tall. Wrong. Too still. My gut twisted. Jason. My voice barely came out. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Then, finally, movement. Slow, jerky. A figure emerged from the trees. It was Jason, or at least it looked like him. But something was wrong. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted too far to the left. His mouth was slightly open, breathing too slow, too deep. His clothes were right. Same jacket, same jeans. But the way he moved? Like he wasn't used to his own body. Troy let out a nervous laugh. Dude, you scared the hell out of us. Jason didn't answer. Just stood there, staring. My skin crawled. Something's not right. This isn't right. Then he took a step forward, and I nearly screamed. His feet were bare. His boots were still back at camp. But here he was, standing in front of us, with no shoes, no socks, not even a speck of dirt on his skin. Troy finally noticed too. His breath hitched. Jace, where are your shoes, man? Jason's mouth twitched, like he was trying to smile, but didn't remember how. Then, in that same flat, unnatural voice, he said, I need help. The exact same words as before. Same tone. Same pause between them. My whole body locked up. That wasn't Jason. It was something wearing him, testing him, trying to figure out how to be human. I grabbed Troy's arm, yanking him backward. That's not him. My voice was barely a whisper. But I knew, in that moment, I was right. Jason, or the thing pretending to be Jason, took another step. His head tilted further. The movement made my stomach churn, like bones shifting the wrong way. Then he whispered, too soft, too controlled. I need help. The exact same words. Again. And that's when we ran. We ran like hell. Back through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, not caring if we tripped, not caring if we got lost. Anything was better than staying. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew. I didn't want to see what Jason was turning into. Troy was right beside me, panting hard. That wasn't him, he gasped. I couldn't answer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but we couldn't stop. We had to reach camp. The truck. Safety. But the moment we burst into the clearing, my stomach dropped. The fire was out. The tents were gone. No, not gone. Torn apart. Shreds of fabric, poles bent at unnatural angles, gear scattered everywhere. Like something had ripped through them. Troy let out a broken sound, somewhere between a sob and a curse. What the fuck is happening? Then, the footsteps started again. Slow. Heavy. Coming from the trees. I turned, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The thing that looked like Jason was stepping into the clearing. But it wasn't walking right. It was copying us. Moving in jerky, uneven strides, like it was still figuring out how legs worked. And its face, God. Jason's skin looked too loose, like it wasn't fitted right over his bones. His mouth still hung slightly open, that eerie, almost smile frozen in place. He stopped a few feet from us, staring. Then, in that same flat voice, he said, I need help. I grabbed Troy's wrist and yanked him toward the truck. The keys. Where the hell were the keys? I tore through my pockets, my pulse hammering in my ears. Found them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely shove the key into the lock. The second I did, we dove inside, locking the doors. Troy was crying, gripping the dashboard. Drive. Fucking drive. I didn't hesitate. I turned the key, and the truck roared to life. Headlights flooded the trees. But Jason, or what was pretending to be him, didn't flinch. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward. For a split second, the headlights passed over him. And in that moment, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Jason's face was peeling, like the skin was coming loose, slipping, revealing something darker underneath. Then we were past him, speeding down the dirt road, the trees blurring by. But the last thing I heard before we left that place for good? Jason's voice. From behind us. Still whispering. Still asking for help. We didn't stop. Not for miles. The truck rattled over the dirt road, the tires skidding on loose gravel, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles white, my foot pressing the gas like that thing was still right behind us. Troy sat beside me, shaking, his breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. When we finally reached a paved road, I thought I'd feel better. I didn't. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of a tiny town, the first sign of life we'd seen in hours. The place was empty, the neon sign flickering above us. I parked, killed the engine, and just sat there, my mind racing. What the hell had we just seen? Troy wiped a hand down his face, his eyes hollow. We should call someone. His voice cracked. I nodded, but we both knew the truth. What could we even say? That something took Jason? That it wore his face? That he wasn't human anymore? No one would believe us. Hell, I barely believed it. We checked the news for days after. Nothing. No missing person report. No search efforts. It was like Jason had never existed. Troy stopped answering my texts. I think he wanted to forget. I wanted to too. But how do you forget something like that? Then, 3 weeks later, I got a text. From Jason's number. Just 2 words. Come back. My stomach turned. I stared at the screen, my fingers cold. I wanted to ignore it, to delete it, but then my phone buzzed again. Another message. A picture. I hesitated, then clicked it open. And what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a photo of my apartment building, taken from outside. I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. I ran to the window, yanked open the blinds. No one was there. The street was empty, silent. But I knew I was being watched. I blocked the number, threw my phone across the room like that would help. But that night, as I lay in bed, barely able to breathe, I heard it. From the hallway. A voice. Flat. Wrong. I need help. My name is Brandon Michael Tate. I'm 28 years old, and I live in Boise, Idaho. I've always been into the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, camping, anything that gets me out of the city for a while. But I've never been the kind of guy who takes big risks. I like having an escape plan, knowing there's a road or a ranger station not too far away. That's why this trip was different. Way different. It started with Adam, an old friend from college. He called me up out of nowhere, said he had a buddy, Sean, who knew about this hidden spot in Los Padres National Forest, California. No tourists, no trails, just untouched wilderness, Adam said. That should have been my first sign to say no. But I didn't. The drive down was brutal. 12 hours from Boise to some tiny town near the forest, then another 2 hours on dirt roads that barely looked drivable. By the time we reached the spot Sean had picked, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. The place was eerily perfect. Thick trees, total silence, and no signs that anyone had ever camped there before. That first night was normal. We set up camp, built a fire, cracked a few beers. Sean swore the fishing here was amazing, so we made plans to check out the river in the morning. Everything felt calm, peaceful. But now, looking back, that was the last time anything felt right. Because sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, heavy, like the forest was pressing in on me. Then I noticed it was too quiet. I listened hard, waiting for the usual sounds, wind in the trees, bugs, anything. But there was nothing. Just pure, unnatural silence. Then I heard it. A faint clicking sound. Soft, rhythmic. Like 2 rocks tapping together. It came from somewhere just beyond our tents, deep in the trees. I held my breath, straining to listen. Click, click, click. Then it stopped. And the second it did, the night sounds came back all at once. Crickets, wind, like nothing had ever happened. I told myself I imagined it, that it was nothing. But that was a lie. Because in the morning, when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Strange symbols, carved into the trees. And every single one was facing our camp. I stared at the carvings for a long time, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Each symbol was different, twisting lines, sharp angles, circles with slashes through them. They weren't letters. They weren't numbers. Just marks. And the worst part? They were fresh. No moss, no weathering. Someone had done this recently. Adam walked up behind me, yawning. Dude, what are you looking at? I pointed. He frowned, stepping closer. Huh. Weird. That was all he said. Like it wasn't a big deal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. That these symbols weren't just random scratches. They meant something. Sean wasn't fazed at all. Probably just some bored hikers messing around. He slapped Adam on the back. Come on, man. Let's hit the river. I hesitated. We should talk about this. Sean sighed. Talk about what? You think some ancient forest cult is going to come after us? He laughed. Adam laughed too. I didn't. We hiked to the river, but I couldn't focus. Something felt off. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed wrong. Some were stripped of bark. Others had deep gashes, like something had raked massive claws across them. I tried to tell myself it was just weather damage. But deep down, I knew better. The river was gorgeous, crystal clear, slow-moving, untouched. But even standing on the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing back at the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just shadows that seemed to stretch too far. Sean and Adam waded in, casting their lines. I stayed back, still uneasy. Then, out of nowhere, Adam let out a sharp yelp. I turned to see him stumbling back onto shore, his face pale. Something just touched my leg, he muttered. Sean rolled his eyes. Probably a fish, dude. But Adam didn't look convinced. We headed back to camp before sunset. That's when we found the footprints. They were right outside our tents. Deep, bare footprints. Too big for any of us. And the strangest part? They weren't leading toward camp. They were leading away. Like something had been standing there, watching us, and then walked back into the woods. I felt sick. My skin crawled. We should leave. Sean groaned. Seriously, man? Over some dumb footprints? I looked at him. They weren't there this morning. His face twitched, just for a second, before he forced a grin. So, maybe it was an animal. But we all knew the truth. Those weren't animal tracks. And whatever left them, it was still out there. That night, the air felt different. The wind had died. The forest was still, and even the fire's crackling seemed muffled, like the world had gone quiet on purpose. We tried to act normal, but we weren't fooling anyone. None of us were relaxed anymore. Adam kept glancing over his shoulder. Sean stared into the fire, barely talking. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. About how they hadn't come from the woods. They had led back into them, meaning that whatever left them, it had been standing here, watching us. At some point, we all drifted to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, listening, waiting. Every noise outside made my pulse spike. A twig snapping, a rustling leaf, the faintest shift of fabric. I told myself it was my imagination, until I heard the clicking. Click, click, click. Soft, deliberate, like two stones tapping together. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. I had heard it the night before. I held my breath, gripping my sleeping bag. The clicking moved closer. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like a pattern, like language. Then, from Adam's tent, a whisper, too low to hear. I strained, listening. Then, a second voice. Not Adam's. The hair on my arms stood up. My mouth went dry. There was someone else in his tent. I barely had time to react before Adam let out a strangled gasp. Then a scramble of movement. A zipper ripping open. A thud. A second later, Adam's footsteps pounded into the woods. Running. I tore out of my tent. Sean did too. Adam. I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Just the trees shifting, something crashing through the brush. Then, faint and distant, Adam's voice echoed back, but wrong. Guys, I need help. Sean's breath hitched. Dude, that wasn't Adam. His voice shook. I gritted my teeth, staring into the dark. We had a choice. Go after him, or stay here, where it was safe. Then, from deep in the woods. Click, click, click. We weren't safe. Sean and I stood frozen, staring into the trees. Adam's voice had come from deep in the woods. But there was no way he had run that far that fast. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. My stomach twisted. We have to go, I whispered. Sean didn't argue. He was already grabbing his pack. I turned to my tent, yanking my bag free. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. Something moved in the trees. A shape, shifting between the branches. My breath caught. It was watching us. Waiting. Then, from the dark, click, click, click. Sean cursed under his breath. We run on 3. I swallowed hard, nodding. 1. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. 2. The wind picked up, carrying something foul. Rotting earth. Decay. 3. We bolted. We tore through the campsite, sprinting toward the trail that led to the truck. I could hear something behind us. Not running, moving. The trees swayed as it passed, the branches bending too much, too wide. Like it was something bigger than a person. Something not meant to exist. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Sean was ahead of me, breathing hard, his flashlight bouncing wildly. Almost there, he gasped. I could see the truck through the trees, so close. Then a sound. Adam's voice. Right next to me. Guys, help me. I almost tripped. My whole body screamed run. But my brain made the mistake of looking, turning my head. And what I saw, I will never forget. It looked like Adam, but it wasn't. His skin was stretched too tight, his mouth too wide. And his eyes? Wrong. Not scared. Not pleading. Just empty. Hollow. Then it smiled. I slammed into Sean, shoving him forward. Go. We crashed through the last stretch of trees, the truck just feet away. I yanked the door open, barely registering Sean diving into the passenger seat. Locked the doors. Shaking. Praying. Then, as I turned the key, the headlights flooded the trees. And in the glow, I saw them. Not just one. Dozens. Tall, unmoving figures standing between the trees. Watching us. And every single one was smiling. The truck roared to life, the headlights cutting through the dark. Sean was screaming, gripping the dashboard like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning against the dirt before catching. We shot forward. But the figures in the trees? They didn't move. They just stood there, watching, smiling. My breath hitched. I kept expecting them to charge at us, to chase us down. But they just let us go. Like we weren't worth the effort. Like we had already lost. I didn't slow down until we hit pavement. By then, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep them on the wheel. Sean was staring out the window, silent, unblinking. Neither of us spoke. What the hell could we even say? We had seen something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist. We reached a gas station a few towns over, parked under the bright lights. But I still didn't feel safe. The air felt too open, exposed, like we had dragged something back with us. Sean turned to me, his voice hoarse. We're not calling the cops. It wasn't a question. I nodded. What would we even tell them? We sat there for hours. Eventually, Sean mumbled something about going home. We drove in silence, barely looking at each other. The weight of what happened sat between us, heavy and unspoken. When we finally parted ways, I knew. We would never talk about it again. A week passed. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text. From Adam's number. Where did you go? I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. I wanted to ignore it. Block the number. But then, a second text. A photo. My front door. Taken from outside. I ran to the window, yanked open the blinds. Nothing. The street was empty. But as I stood there, frozen, my phone buzzed again. A voice message. Hands shaking, I pressed play. Silence at first. Then click, click, click. The sound of stones tapping together. Then, finally, a whisper. Adam's voice. Guys, I need help. The exact same words. The exact same tone. It was still out there. And now, it knew where I lived. My name is Daniel Thomas Mercer. I'm 30 years old, and I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. I wouldn't call myself an expert camper, but I've done enough trips over the years to know my way around the woods. I know how to pitch a tent, build a fire, and read a map. But nothing I've ever experienced prepared me for what happened in the Trinity Alps Wilderness, California. It started with my old college buddy, Evan, who convinced me to take this trip. Dude, we gotta do something big, he had said. No marked trails, no crowded campsites, just pure wilderness. He sent me photos of this hidden valley deep in the Trinity Alps. The pictures were unreal. Towering pines, a crystal clear lake, snow-capped peaks in the distance. I hesitated. I liked camping, but I also liked knowing there was an easy way out. But Evan was relentless, and eventually, I caved. Our third guy, Jonah, was the same, more into snowboarding and rock climbing than deep woods survival, but he was always up for an adventure. That's how we ended up loading up our gear and heading out for 4 days in the most remote part of the wilderness we could find. The hike in was brutal. 15 miles of rough terrain, no trail markers, an elevation that had my lungs burning. But when we finally reached the valley, it was even more beautiful than the photos. The lake was untouched, mirror still, reflecting the sky like glass. No signs of people, no trash, just pure, wild nature. The first day was perfect. We set up camp, fished in the lake, and relaxed. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. That night, we built a fire, cooked up some trout, and sat under a sky so full of stars it didn't seem real. We joked, we drank, we talked about life. It was exactly what we came for. But something about that first night sat wrong with me. It was too quiet. I didn't notice it at first, caught up in the peace of being disconnected from everything. But as I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric ceiling, I realized there was no sound, no wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just this thick, heavy silence that made my skin crawl, like the whole forest was waiting. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A high-pitched wail. Not an animal, not the wind, something else. The sound didn't belong. It wasn't the cry of a coyote, and it wasn't the wind cutting through the mountains. It was human, but something about it was wrong. Stretched, distorted, like someone screaming through a broken radio. Far away, but too clear. I sat up fast, my heart pounding. For a second, I thought maybe Evan or Jonah had heard it too, but their tents were still. Silent. I held my breath, listening. The sound had stopped. Nothing but thick, heavy quiet. The kind of silence that feels intentional, like something is listening back. I waited for a long time before I let myself breathe again. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I imagined it. But even as I tried to convince myself, I felt that deep, twisting unease in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I didn't say anything at first. I figured if Evan and Jonah had heard it, they'd bring it up. They didn't. We ate breakfast, packed our gear, and hiked farther into the valley to explore. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow. Then Jonah stopped. "You guys see that?" He pointed toward a cluster of trees ahead. At first, I didn't see what he was talking about. But as we got closer, my stomach tightened. Something was wrong with the trees. Their bark was peeled away in long, ragged strips. Not cut, torn. The wood beneath was deep red, like muscle stripped raw. I reached out, running my fingers over the grooves. The cuts were fresh. Evan clicked his tongue. A bear, maybe? Jonah frowned. Bears don't strip bark like this. I didn't say anything. I knew he was right. The pattern was too deliberate. Repetitive. Like something had done this on purpose. As we stood there, a sharp gust of wind rushed through the trees. It was the first real sound I had heard since waking up, and it sent a chill down my spine. That silence from last night still lingered, just beneath the noise. Watching. Waiting. I finally forced myself to speak. Maybe we shouldn't stay here too long. Evan just laughed, clapping me on the back. Dude, relax. We came out here for the isolation, right? He turned and started walking again. Jonah hesitated, but followed. I didn't move right away, because as the wind died down, I swore I heard something else. A whisper, somewhere in the trees. I caught up with Evan and Jonah, forcing myself to ignore the whispering. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The hike felt longer than it should have. The trees too dense, too quiet. The deeper we went, the more I felt it. Something was watching us. We stopped near a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The view was incredible. Rolling green hills, untouched wilderness stretching for miles. But I couldn't enjoy it. The whisper still echoed in my head. Soft, almost familiar. I turned to Jonah. Do you feel weird out here? He hesitated. Yeah, but maybe it's just the isolation. I nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. Evan, of course, wasn't worried. This place is amazing, he said, setting his pack down. Let's eat before we head back. He acted like nothing was wrong. I envied him for that. We ate in silence. Jonah kept glancing at the trees. I kept glancing at Jonah. Neither of us wanted to say it, but we were thinking the same thing. Something was off. The air felt thick, like the weight of the sky had dropped down on us. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Then we heard the wail. It started low, barely audible over the wind. But it grew, stretched, warped. That same inhuman sound from last night. Only this time, it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. Jonah dropped his food. What the hell was that? Evan finally looked uneasy. Coyote, maybe? I shook my head. No way. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like something trying to be human. We stood up fast, eyes scanning the trees. The wail stopped. Silence crashed down around us. A silence so deep it swallowed up the sound of the wind, the birds, everything. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, from behind us, a twig snapped. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. Nothing. But I knew. I knew something was there. Hiding. Watching. Evan let out a nervous chuckle. Guys, let's not freak ourselves out. Then the voice came. Not a wail. Not a whisper. A woman's voice. From deep in the trees. Soft. Calling. Help me. We froze. My skin crawled. The voice had come from the trees behind us. Soft, distant, but too clear. Like someone was standing just out of sight. Listening. Waiting. Jonah's breathing turned ragged. Did you hear that? Evan's face had lost its usual confidence. Yeah, but maybe it's a lost hiker? My gut said no. No hiker would be this deep in the wilderness. No gear, no calls for help until now. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. We need to go? Now. I expected Evan to argue, but for once, he didn't. He just nodded. Jonah grabbed his pack with shaking hands. We started moving fast. We hiked in silence. Fast, but careful, listening for more sounds. The trees felt tighter, the air heavier. Every step made me feel like I was walking into something's trap, like we weren't supposed to leave. My brain kept screaming, don't look back. Don't listen. Just move. Then a wail. Loud. Right behind us. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing. But the sound had been right there. Jonah swore under his breath. What the hell is going on? The forest felt wrong. Warped. Like the space around us was shifting. Then the voice came again. Help me. Closer. Too close. The exact same tone, the exact same rhythm. Like a recording being played over and over. Evan turned, his voice shaking. We have to run. None of us hesitated. We bolted. Branches whipped against my arms, roots snagged at my boots, but I didn't stop. The campsite was miles away, but we ran like it was right in front of us. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But behind us, the voice followed. Help me. Right in my ear. I nearly tripped. My vision blurred with panic. Jonah was ahead of me, Evan right behind. The trees shifted in my vision, like something was moving between them, something fast. My stomach twisted. We weren't alone. Then I saw it. In the trees, just ahead, a figure. Tall. Still. Waiting for us. And as we ran straight toward it, it finally moved. The figure stepped forward. My legs nearly gave out, my body screaming for me to stop, but there was no time. We were running straight toward it. The firelight from my flashlight barely reached its face, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. It was a woman, or at least, it looked like one. Her skin was gray, too smooth, stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes, too large, too empty. But the worst part was her mouth. It hung slightly open, moving, but the words didn't match the movement. That same flat, repeating voice echoed from her lips. Help me. Over and over. The exact same tone. Like a recording on loop. I grabbed Jonah's arm, yanking him sideways. Go. Go. We veered off, crashing through the brush, nearly tumbling down a small incline. Evan was right behind us, his breath sharp and panicked. The thing didn't chase us. It just turned its head, watching, waiting. We didn't stop. Couldn't. The trail was ahead, the path back to camp. My mind raced. We had to get to the truck. We had to get out. But as we ran, I realized something that nearly stopped my heart. The forest was shifting. The trees, they weren't where they should be. The path we had hiked in, it didn't look the same. My flashlight barely cut through the dark, but my gut told me what I didn't want to admit. We were lost. Jonah gasped. This isn't the right way. Evan cursed under his breath. No, we followed the trail. We did, but the trees didn't care. They loomed around us, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Like they had moved while we weren't looking. And then, silence. No voice. No footsteps. Just a deep, suffocating stillness. My hands shook. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning, searching, waiting for something to step out. But nothing did. Just empty space. That was almost worse. Then, somewhere behind us, soft clicking. Like two stones tapping together. Slow. Rhythmic. Measured. My breath caught. We ran again, blindly pushing forward, not caring where the path led, as long as it led away. And then, suddenly, the truck, parked exactly where we left it. like the forest had finally decided to let us go. My name is Trevor James Holloway. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. I'm the kind of guy who likes the outdoors, but I wouldn't call myself a survivalist. I know how to set up camp. I can start a fire, but I also like knowing there's a road or a ranger station not too far away. That's why when my old high school friend, Danny, suggested a camping trip deep in Stanislaus National Forest, California, I hesitated. "This place is different, man," Danny had said. "No crowds, no tourists, just real wilderness." That should have been my first red flag. Places that are truly untouched, they're that way for a reason. But Danny was persistent, and our other friend Kyle was already on board. So I gave in. 3 nights, deep in the woods. How bad could it be? The drive out was brutal. Hours of winding roads, no cell service, no signs of civilization. By the time we reached the last stretch, a barely visible dirt road leading into the forest, I was already feeling uneasy. Kyle was driving, and even he muttered, "Man, this is a little more isolated than I expected." We finally found a spot near a small, stagnant pond, surrounded by towering trees. It was exactly the kind of place Danny had promised. No other campers, no signs of people, just untouched wilderness. But as I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs, I noticed something that sent a small ripple of unease through me. There were no animal sounds. No birds. No insects. Just silence. Danny was already unloading the gear. "This is perfect," he said, grinning. Kyle didn't seem convinced. "Yeah, a little too perfect." I forced a chuckle, trying to shake the feeling. Maybe I was just overthinking it. We set up camp, built a fire, cracked some beers. By nightfall, everything seemed normal. We sat around, telling stories, enjoying the quiet. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, I started to notice it again. That silence. Not peaceful, not empty, like the forest itself was listening. Then, just after midnight, I heard it. A single, heavy footstep. Not an animal. Something big. I sat up fast, my heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows around our camp. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the crackling embers. Silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl, like the whole world is holding its breath. I turned toward Kyle's tent. "Did you hear that?" My voice was barely above a whisper. No response. I glanced at Danny. He was still sitting by the fire, staring into the dark like he was waiting for something. That's when I knew. I hadn't imagined it. Then, another footstep. Slow. Deliberate. From somewhere beyond the trees. My breath caught. This wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was too heavy. Too controlled. I could feel the weight of it, vibrating through the ground. Danny finally spoke, his voice tight. That wasn't an animal. He reached for the flashlight beside him, flicking it on. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but endless trunks. No movement. No eyes reflecting the light back at us. But that didn't make me feel any better. Kyle's tent rustled. He unzipped it and poked his head out, groggy. "What's going on?" Danny kept the flashlight trained on the trees. "We heard something." Kyle frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Probably a moose." I shook my head. "No way." It sounded like a person. Silence. Kyle exhaled, zipping up his tent again. "Well, unless Bigfoot's out there, I'm going back to sleep." He didn't believe us. Hell, I barely believed us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching. Waiting. Danny and I sat there for a while, listening. Nothing. No more footsteps. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was nothing. Just our imaginations playing tricks. We put out the fire, crawled into our tents, and tried to sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been standing there, and it had been listening. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to something that made my stomach drop. A noise. Not footsteps this time. Not an animal. Something closer. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Right outside my tent. My body locked up. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. The thin fabric between me and whatever was out there suddenly felt way too thin. My mind screamed at me to call out to Danny or Kyle, but my gut said don't. Don't speak. Don't move. Don't let it know you're awake. The breathing continued. A steady inhale. Pause. Exhale. Pause. It was low and heavy, like whoever, or whatever, was standing there was huge. My fingers trembled as I slowly reached for my flashlight. I wanted to turn it on. I needed to see. But what if I didn't want to see? Then, the zipper on my tent moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. Like someone was thinking about coming inside. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. My brain went into overdrive. What do? Do I yell? Do I run? Do I fight? But before I could decide, the zipper stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps. Leaving. Slow, heavy crunches, moving back toward the trees. I waited, heart hammering, until the sound disappeared completely. Then I bolted. I tore out of my tent, flashlight shaking in my grip. Danny was already awake, standing by the fire pit, his own flashlight aimed at the trees. His face was pale. He had heard it too. Kyle's tent was open, but Kyle was gone. I froze. Kyle's tent was empty. His sleeping bag was still inside, unzipped. His boots? Still there. My stomach twisted. Nobody walks away barefoot in the middle of the night. Danny turned to me, his flashlight trembling. Where the hell is he? I couldn't answer, because I already knew. Danny took a shaky step toward the trees. Kyle. His voice barely carried. No response. He swallowed hard, then turned to me. We have to find him. I wanted to argue, tell him we should grab the truck and go. But Kyle was our friend. We couldn't just leave him out here. We grabbed our gear, flashlights cutting through the dark. The trees loomed, too tall, too quiet. The deeper we went, the more I felt it, like the forest was closing in around us. My gut screamed at me to turn back. But we didn't. Then a sound. Soft. Familiar. Kyle's voice. Guys? I need help. Danny's breath caught. Kyle. He started running. Too fast. I reached for him. Too late. He disappeared into the dark. Danny, wait. My voice cracked, but he was already gone. I stood there, frozen. Alone. Then I heard it. The same words, the same voice. But closer this time. Guys? I need help. My blood turned to ice. It was coming from two places at once. And then, from the trees ahead, Kyle stepped out. But it wasn't him. The figure didn't move. It stood just beyond the flickering glow of the dying fire, half hidden in the trees. Not Kyle. Not Danny. My breath caught in my throat. Too tall. Too still. The shape of it was human, but something about the way it stood, rigid, expectant, unnatural, was deeply wrong. I forced myself to move, to step back toward the truck. My flashlight barely reached it, but I saw the glint of the windshield, 40 yards away. If I could just get inside, I could drive. Get out. Get help. But before I could take another step, it spoke. Guys? I need help. Kyle's voice. But the mouth didn't move. A cold terror gripped my spine. It was like the sound had come from inside it, not from its lips. Like a speaker playing a recording. The exact same words. The exact same tone. My stomach twisted violently. This wasn't real. This wasn't possible. Then, movement. Not from the figure. From the trees. A second shape stepped out. Then a third. More figures, identical, featureless, frozen in place. Watching. Dozens of them. Lining the tree line, waiting. I turned and ran. I sprinted for the truck, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. Behind me, the voices overlapped. Guys? I need help. Over and over, too many voices at once. The sound rattled in my skull, growing louder, sharper, until it didn't sound human at all. I hit the truck at full speed, yanking the door open. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the keys. Come on, come on, come on, I gasped, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Headlights flared across the clearing, and in that moment, I saw them. Not just figures. Faces. Kyle's face. Danny's face. Their expressions stretched too wide, their mouths slightly open, like they were still learning how to wear skin. Like they weren't supposed to be wearing it at all. I screamed, slammed the gas. The truck lurched forward, tearing down the dirt path, bouncing over roots and rocks. The voices followed, even as I sped away. Guys? I need help. Louder. Closer. Then, nothing. Silence. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. I didn't stop shaking for days. But the worst part? Kyle and Danny were never found. Their families filed reports. Search teams combed the area. But there was nothing. No bodies. No footprints. No evidence they had ever been there at all. It's been 6 months. I don't camp anymore. I don't leave the city after dark. But last night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed. A text. From Kyle's number. Guys? I need help. I turned my phone off, my hands clammy, my heart hammering. But as I rolled over, staring at my bedroom door, I realized the text wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the whisper, right outside my window. Guys, I need help.